Thank you. You'll get paid later. So I myself am autistic, as you can see, and this is kind of an open dialogue about what it means to be autistic. And to be honest, 9 times out of 10 when I walk into a room full of people, and to me a room full of people could be one person apart from me, that's full. So usually when I do, I put on a mask, I climb into a skin, and I pretend to be human, because it's easier to do that than show people basically myself. So this is going to be a very open dialogue about what it means to be autistic, and so some parts you'll probably get a good laugh, other parts I could end up crying, but it should all be cool. So autism is a developmental disorder that affects 3 things: communication, behavior, and social imagination. Now, behavior is easier to condense down like that because the other word that they use for it commonly in books is social interaction, which can often get really muddled with social communication, and then basically because there's so much of an overlap, but I'll explain them bit by bit. So communication. People who have autism will frequently be really literal. And it's not to say that when you say it's like raining cats and dogs outside that I think felines are falling from the sky. However, there are cases where you say something to me and I'll look at you and I'll scroll it through in my mind and I'm like, how many different ways can this be taken? Which one's the most appropriate for this situation? Recently, I went away with my partner and we were staying in a hotel. And on the Saturday morning, we had a booking to the restaurant for that evening, so we're down talking to the reception lady, and she says, "What room?" So I look at her for a very uncomfortable 3 seconds, and she looks at me, and I look at her, and my boyfriend steps up and says, "Room 210. We walk away, and I say, "Thank God you were here." He was like, "Why?" I was like, I was genuinely about to reply, "What room do you usually eat in?" And it's that sort of awkwardness where people say something and you wouldn't think there were a lot of ways to take it, but generally I eat in the dining room, so I assumed it would be eating in the dining room, and the question caught me off guard. Another example is every Sunday after having a roast dinner, we'll put the leftover chicken into the slow cooker and make something for that evening. And putting the chicken in, putting a bit of red wine, some spices, and turn around, and my boyfriend asks me, "What are we going to do with it?" And again, awkward 3 seconds. I look at him, he looks at me, I look at him, and I reply, "Eat it." And he's like, "Okay, I guess I should have seen that one coming." And I was like, "Well, what else do you do with food?" And he was like, "Well, I was talking about like pasta or," and I was like, "Well, that's awkward." Apart from that, we have behavior, which is kind of social interaction. Most people would probably know the famous avoiding eye contact. Now, for some people on the spectrum, it could be that eye contact's uncomfortable. It could be that it's almost painful. It's hard to describe. It's a physical sensation that just feels wrong sometimes. With me, if I'm comfortable with someone, I'll look them in the eye and it'll kind of be as intimate as kissing them on the cheek. So you can imagine my dismay when random people like really try to hold my eye contact. I'm like, and they don't understand it. They're like, "But why can't you just look me in the eye? I mean, what's wrong with you?" And I'm kind of like, "It's not what's wrong with me, trust me." And they find that hard to understand. The other things that fall into the category of behavior is intense interests, and some of them are lifelong. So from about the age of 10, I've been writing poetry. And I don't mean like relax, sort of chill, every now and again I grab a pen and paper. I mean, on my laptop I've got like 1,500 poems, and they're not stopping, so that's going to be a bit of an issue eventually, but we'll ignore that. But other ones are kind of passing. So while I was in my second last year of uni, we were studying about rights-based law, and I decided it was a great idea to read all of the Nuremberg trial transcripts. And I'm not talking like a little bit like bedtime reading. I literally read them all of the Gorham transcripts, and luckily my law lecturer, who wrote my reference for my master's actually, put down, yeah, she really goes above and beyond the extra recommended reading, and let's put a positive spin on it. Really, I spent 6 weeks reading these and it had nothing to do with the exam, so again, kind of awkward. And people expect you to have a flexibility, so I can talk for hours about things that I'm interested in, but that's not really what's expected in life. People think that you should be able to make idle chit-chat about the weather and the TV. So my attempts at that usually go, oh, the weather, we're having lots of it. And people are like, wow, you're certainly Sherlock Holmes. And I'm like, well, actually more than you know. And then the last one is social imagination, which is the ability to predict what's coming next. And I don't mean that we lack in any way of the form imagination, because we're writers, we're poets, we're scientists. We have these absolutely incredible minds and we do wonderful things with them. It means that in a conversation, I genuinely won't know what's coming next. You could stand in front of me and we could be talking about one thing, and to the rest of the world, it might be really obvious what's coming next, but I'll end up surprised. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter if it is the most obvious lead up to anything. I won't see it coming, and part of that is that I struggle to read body language. Your faces all look the same to me, no offense, which means that you could be standing there getting aggressive, you could be getting really, really angry with me, and I'll be like, oh yeah, hi. Which means that when you punch me, I did not see that coming. Other people can kind of see the build-up. They're like, oh, this person's getting kind of aggressive. I should back off. I should do this. I kind of stand there oblivious and say, so, the weather. People find that infuriating, it turns out. So, its prevalence is roughly 1 in 100 when including both men and women. Its increase is phenomenal, and there's lots of theories about whether that's just better diagnosis, whether it's actually increasing. Now, the gender differences is interesting because people usually associate it with men, the Sheldon Cooper thing. So a lot of the time when I tell people that, I'm autistic, they're like, but you're a woman. And I'm like, thanks for noticing. People don't typically expect women to have autism. And part of the problem is that when they were actually marking down the symptoms, they were like, hey, let's only study men because that's a good idea, which means that the way that women on the spectrum present is actually pretty different to the way men on the spectrum present. So they kind of fly under the radar. It's meant to be 4 men to every woman, but actually when you start uncovering it, and if you change the diagnosis criteria to fit the way that women present, it's closer to 1 on 1, which means that women aren't being diagnosed at an appropriate age. They usually get diagnosed in their 30s. Now think of that when boys usually get diagnosed before the age of 8. That's a 22-year difference. That is a lot. That is a young person's lifetime. That means that there's no early intervention. That means that there's no extra help. It's just women struggling to get by, which is kind of really sad. So I'm going to show you some very scary numbers. And personally, this is where I have a huge problem. So in the non-autistic community up there, you can see with anxiety disorders, that little red slice, and without the anxiety disorders, that great big yellow piece. In the autistic community, the red is the number of people who suffer from anxiety, and the yellow is without. And I suppose you don't need to be Sherlock Holmes to notice the difference. We can play spot the difference, but I'm fairly sure we all get it, just guessing. That's a huge difference. That's actually kind of shocking. I mean, that's diagnosed anxiety disorder, so we're not talking just general anxiety, we're talking diagnosable within the DSM. And there's lots of people that would like to say that that is just an inherent part of having autism. You're autistic, therefore you're anxious. As if it's part and parcel, as if everything in my DNA that makes me autistic makes me anxious. I think that's a really sad way to look at the world. But I guess that's how they're looking at it right now. And there's a lot of talk in the community about how it is the person with autism, the autistic person's fault, because they don't fit in, therefore it is their fault when they become anxious. Now, one of the key areas of autism is this sensory overload, which means that we can't stop processing information when we should, which means that all the time I pick up visual cues, auditory cues, everything all at once, which means that yes, the world is overwhelming, and sometimes I kind of want to put on my noise cancelling headphones and not see anyone ever. I don't do that, of course, otherwise I wouldn't be here. But yeah, you can understand why some anxiety would be attached to that. But can you really blame that for almost half of the autistic population having diagnosable anxiety? Some more very scary numbers. Depression. 25% in the non-autistic community, some point over their life, will have a form or a bout of depression. Pretty sad numbers. There's the autistic community. You're looking at almost 3/4 of the community ending up with depression. And again, it's this idea that sadness is woven into our DNA, as if we are no more than this autism, and so we're born to end up depressed. And I think that that is a sad way to look at the world, and I think anyone in here would. And we can continue to say that it's part of the genes, but I offer a different explanation, which I'll get onto. There's some scary numbers actually that I didn't put on the board because it would mean accepting them as reality. Those numbers are that 64% of people with autism have suicidal thoughts. 64%. Think about that for a minute, because it would be like 1 in 3 not, and it would be 2/3 of the audience who end up feeling suicidal. And of that, before the age of 17, 17% of people with autism will attempt suicide. That's horrific. And I didn't put them on the board actually because it would mean accepting them as reality, and I can't do that because I've got too many friends and too many family members who are also autistic. And it would be like standing them in a row and saying that one of them is going to be lost. Now, those numbers are terrifying, and here's where I put it down to. Discrimination against autistic persons is the rule rather than the exception. And that's a UN rights expert, so think about that for a minute. In my small lifetime, 23 years, I have faced some pretty horrible experiences in where I tell someone that I have autism, that I'm autistic, and I get met with varying responses. Some of them are pleasant, some of them are surprised. The majority of them are, but you're a little bit too pretty to have autism. Some of them are, oh good God, I'm so sorry, that must be horrendous. And I'm like, I never thought of it like that, but okay. Some of them are lacking, they're like, oh, but you can't actually be autistic. And that's the problem. You can tell someone that you're autistic, but chances are, if you talk, they're not going to believe you. Which brings me to this scale. There's a high-functioning autistic individual and a low-functioning, and we in the community actually hate this language because it narrows people down. Because I started talking by a certain age, I am classed as high-functioning. If I had waited a few more months before developing an attitude, I would be classed as low-functioning. The funny thing is, it's the different sides that people see to me. I've been on 3 different types of medication for anxiety. I have frequent autistic meltdowns where I rock backwards and forwards, pick at my skin, headbang, and nod in the music sense of the word, where I would be described as low functioning. And no one sees that part of me because I keep it to those closest. The rest of the world sees a bright girl who they describe as having a bright future, which means that they think that I don't struggle. 42% of people with autism, if they end up getting a job, will be fired because they cannot socially fit in. They can do the job, that's fine, but they can't socially fit in. And bear in mind, that number is within 18% of people who actually get employed. Because if you have autism, if you are autistic, despite it just meaning that you look at the world a little bit differently, that's the chance you have of being employed in the first place. Less than 1 in 5 people on the spectrum end up in full-time employment. And then we wonder why, when we go back, you've got that. I mean, it's kind of common sense, you'd think. So my research is basically taking this and saying, well, actually, it's a form of minority stress. Because we fit into literally a small minority of the population, and the discrimination that we deal with day in, day out, day in, day out, has wear and tear. So 43% of autistic adults lost their job because of not having, or because of having or disclosing autism. So some of it was literally walked into the office and said, hey, I'm autistic. And they were like, oh, might as well go empty out your drawers then, which is really awkward. And the problem is there's lots of people who are like, oh yeah, but you've got discrimination laws for this. But the problem is they don't come into play fast enough. The time that it takes to actually get a lawsuit like that to go through, where you're like, actually, I got fired because I have autism, already wears down on A, your mental health, B, your financial well-being, and C, your physical health because of stress. 10% of autistic individuals received support from their employers. That's it. That's a terrifying number. That is a terrifying number because even if you disclose your autism and you manage to hold on to your job, which you're fairly lucky to be able to do, only 1 in 10 get help, and that's despite 50% wanting it. And lastly, that number right there, 80% experienced bullying at work. So that's after school. That's after university, so you can get through all of that and be standing up and be trying to be proud, trying to hold on to the last shreds of your self-esteem, and chances are you'll end up bullied in the workplace. There is such a gap because of isolation, because of self-doubt, discrimination, bullying, lack of acceptance, lack of support, stigma, and miscommunication. It is terrifying. So my research is the minority stress model, and that is a model which has typically been used to describe the difference in life outcomes in minorities. So for example, ethnic minorities, LGBT minorities, typically we see that they have a higher mortality rate, they have higher levels of anxiety, of depression. Basically, they have lives that don't level up to the expected. And you can keep saying that it is in some way woven in our genetics, that we were born to fail, that we were born to be unhappy, that we were born to be anxious, and that we have nothing to offer the world. Which, fair enough, if you want to take that point of view, I think you're missing out on something really great. You should meet my nephew. Personally, I think that it's something else. And I think that if we level the playing field, the rate of depression, the rate of mortality, the rate of suicide, the rate of anxiety, the rate of self-harm, the rate of bullying, the rate of unemployment, the rate of people who are autistic ending up in domestically violent situations will rapidly decrease. Isn't that kind of funny? That all you have to do is even out the playing field. And you know what? It's time for a movement. It's time to change things. We as society, using the language that we use, using the words that we do, we build our society. It is something that is flexible, and it is something that's moldable. And we can either choose to keep it the same, or we can choose to change it now. And I tell you what, if we don't change it now, we are going to have a really, really big problem on our hands. Because there's only so long that you can suffer from suicidal thoughts without completing. We will have a generation that thinks that it is easier to take their own lives than to keep going. I don't think it's inevitable. I think it takes redefining what we class as ordinary. And lots of people have actually said to me, they're like, you do realize what you're doing. I mean, it's never going to work. And I look at them and I was like, you've never seen how determined I can be. And that's the thing. It takes a certain level of determination. Basically, it's time to put the onus back on society and reshape futures. So, what autistic people want you to know, and this is from people all over the world, this isn't just coming from me. Pretty much everyone that I've disclosed to have said something like, you don't seem autistic to me, but if that makes you feel better, or I know someone who's autistic and you don't act like them, don't be that person. Like, I'm not even kidding, don't. If someone tells you that they are autistic, be like, oh yeah, cool. So, food. You don't have to make a big deal about it, and you don't have to compare them. That's like saying, yeah, you've got brown hair, but you don't look like my friend who also has brown hair. Wonder why. And that's the thing. I get met with that quite a bit, actually. It doesn't matter who I'm telling, whether it's someone that I work with, whether it's new friends. I say, you know, actually, I'm autistic. And they're like, but you don't act like Sheldon Cooper. I'm like, thank God for that. More. Being cured is not an option. We do our best, but we will never not be autistic. The most frustrating thing is that people want to accept that you think differently, but they still expect that one day you'll be fixed. That's kind of sad. In fact, actually, you might have noticed about a week ago that they managed to reverse autistic genetics in mice. I remember it really clearly because I read it and I was like, no, I'm fine, you know, scientific discovery, it's fine, because I myself love neuroscience, so I can understand the push for science. And actually, I was walking to collect a package, called my mum, burst into tears, and she said, what's wrong? And I was like, well, they've managed to reverse autism in mice. I think I'm too late. And she said, too late for what? And I said, I've been pushing for society to be accepting my whole life. But it has actually been easier to rewrite the genetic code than to become accepting. We don't want to be cured. And I actually had this debate with someone and they said, but why do you get a say in it? Because you're high functioning. And I said, well, that's funny because you don't know the backstory. Yeah, sometimes I might look human and I do my best to. Some days I don't get out of bed. But I have never once in that time thought that the problem was me. I've looked at society and said, yes, I don't fit, but hopefully society will change. And the problem was, while I was on the phone to my mother, I realized that no, I'm a bit late for that. They are literally trying to cure autism rather than becoming a little bit more accepting, and that is a terrifying thought. Empathy is actually a thing for us, I promise. Sometimes we show it wrong, not going to lie. So I'm the most empathetic person I know, even if my face won't show it. Don't be the person who says an autistic person doesn't care. Actually, we have the biggest hearts going because we feel so deeply, because literally we're constantly bringing in stimulus. That means that when we're sad, we're really sad. When we're happy, we're really happy. Yeah, it takes other things. For example, if you tell me that you broke a nail, I'm not going to care. I'm sorry. Like, there are worse things that are happening right now, and that's the thing. We're so busy looking at the bigger picture that with the small things, we're like, grow another one. But we certainly have a huge amount of empathy. We think it can be a gift. It hurts our feelings when people talk about it like it's a disease or like it should be cured. I wish people would stop viewing it as such a negative thing. People often see us as something that needs to be fixed. Just because we don't fit into the definition of normal doesn't mean we aren't normal. We aren't broken. We are normal people. And I guess it's to us. Lots of people wouldn't consider me normal, but that's okay because they love me anyway. We are just a different type of person. Yeah, we don't like looking in the eye, and we do weird things sometimes. For example, like, I count my steps and I always try to finish on a nice even number, and even if that means I have to take the long way around, I will take the long way around, and if I have to walk in a bit of a circle, I'll walk in a bit of a circle. That doesn't mean that I should be erased from humanity. That's a little bit dramatic, I think. We don't want to be cured. Be part of the change. When I finish up, I just want to leave you with one thought, and that is this. I think my method of communication is pretty direct, as I imagine you guys do. When I was a kid, and we would have people over, and bear in mind this is from the stage that I could walk and talk. If I decided that, no, you'd been in my space long enough, I'd go get your bag and your keys and your jacket, walk up to you, put them in your hands and say, bye now. It was nice seeing you. My parents thought that it was pretty funny until it was me doing it to family and they were meant to be there for the weekend. I wasn't impressed when they didn't leave. I think my method of communicating, even if it's unique, is pretty straightforward. I think my behavior, even if it seems weird to you, and bear in mind, I do my best to stop it spilling out into the world, even if that means that I melt down more when I get home. It might not make sense to you, but it makes sense to me. And lastly, we can change society, and I'm not standing here hoping to kind of, I don't know, discover something amazing. Like, I'm never going to be like Einstein, and I'm not going to prove that there's gravitational waves, even if that would be pretty cool. All I'm asking for is that you see what is beneath the surface, and the next time someone stands in front of you and says, well, we should be curing autism, you ask them why. And you really keep digging down into that narrative and say, well, actually, don't you think that we could just adjust a little? It doesn't take much. Thank you.